Hello everyone, I'm Tom Secker. I am a researcher and filmmaker. I've been following the 7/7 case for years now. I've made two separate documentaries, both of which are freely available online, anyone can watch them. The first, in 2010, is called 7/7 Seeds of Deconstruction, and it is essentially a summary of the anomalies, the conspiracy theories, the outstanding questions and issues as they stood at that time in 2010. Then, at the end of 2010-11, into 2011, we got the July 7th inquests into the deaths of the 52 victims, and an awful lot of new information came out through those, so I decided I'll make an additional documentary covering all of this stuff, reviewing the existing questions, all the rest of it. That's called 7/7 Crime and Prejudice, and like I say, anyone can watch these. They're free, they're on YouTube and on other video sites as well. When the inquests ended in May 2011, they left the official story in something of a paradoxical position, because Lady Justice Hallett, the coroner, ruled at the end of the inquests that there would be no investigation, no inquests into the deaths of the 4 alleged suicide bombers. So having concluded that these 52 people had died in suicide bombings, the state, the government, is effectively saying, we're not going to look into the deaths of these alleged suicide bombers. And without having proven that those men killed themselves, that they were suicide bombers, how can one accept the conclusion that the 52 died because of suicide bombings? So this is a paradox, and I think the only real answer to this paradox is to reinvestigate the crime, reinvestigate 7/7. We can do this ourselves, we can press for further official investigations. Ultimately, I think things like a public inquiry, it would be a good accomplishment, but it probably wouldn't necessarily tell us anything that we don't already know. So I think the emphasis has to be on our own investigation. It has to be on taking the power ourselves and the responsibility ourselves to do this, rather than trying to press the state and trying to get the state to tell us, the truth about all of this. Now, to investigate it, we have to use the evidence that we've got and the evidence that we can subsequently get access to. And a lot of this has been destroyed. For example, the 3 carriages where bombs went off, the 3 tube train carriages, they've all been scrapped. They've all been melted down, they've disappeared. And all the carriages alongside them, the adjacent carriages, they were sent all the way to Hungary to be repaired, as though we don't have the capacity to repair tube trains in this country. Very, very strange, very suspicious. Nonetheless, at the inquest we did get a lot of new information and a lot of new evidence, and in particular in terms of the physical evidence, we had diagrams of these tube carriages and where the explosions are supposed to have taken place within them. Now, I'm not going to get into this in detail right now because it works better visually, and I went through it in my film, so I'd recommend for the answer to that to watch the film. But fundamentally, it doesn't add up. Fundamentally, where they say these explosions took place, and where they say the alleged bombers were, and where they say people were before the explosion and where the bodies ended up, does not fit together. It just doesn't. So we have to ask the question, were these men even on those trains and on that bus? Were those explosions even caused by backpacks or any other bomb that was left there by terrorists, or were they caused by something else? The problem with this sort of argument is that to resolve that one fully, we would probably need access to the physical evidence that's been destroyed, so we may never get a proper answer to that one. We may never be able to put that one to bed. It's very difficult, in my mind, if not impossible, to see a fresh prosecution, a viable prosecution of someone emerging from that route of investigation, simply because the evidence has been destroyed and we don't have it in order to place it in front of a court and try and prosecute these people. So I'm going to talk about a quite different route, and this very much relates to what Ian was just talking about with intelligence failures. What were the intelligence agencies doing before these attacks? What did they know? How did they react to it? So even though the police investigation hasn't actually produced a single conviction in relation to 7/7, they prosecuted 3 men, but the 3 men were innocent, and they were found innocent. So, to date, no one effectively has been held responsible for this. And even though we've had no public inquiry, no judicial inquiry, no truth commission, no anything of that sort, we do have an awful lot of information now about the security services. We probably have more information about what they knew, when they knew it, and what they did than we have on any other aspect of this case. So that is something I've very much focused on in my work, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Now, we had 2 reports by the Intelligence and Security Committee, one in 2006, one in 2009, and these were looking into what the security services knew before 7/7. The inquests have also made a whole load of primary source documents from MI5, West Yorkshire Police, Special Branch, made these documents available to us, and these are authentic, and we can go and check them. You can find them freely online. You can look at them yourselves. So, even before we get to the question of mainstream media coverage of this, we have a lot of information to go on. We were initially told that these 4 suspects were clean skins. I'm sure you remember this phrase. Charles Clarke, I think, used it. I.e., people who were previously unknown to the security services, that they had no records on them whatsoever. Within a matter of weeks, this was proven to be untrue. Only 3 months after 7/7, BBC Newsnight, there was an episode of Newsnight which started breaking down this story and started demonstrating that, in fact, the security services did have quite a lot of information on these 4 guys well before 7/7 happened. So the first ISC report in May 2006, it basically concluded that 2 of the alleged bombers had appeared on the periphery of another investigation. That's essentially what they said about it. At the 2007 trial of these men, who were the subject of this investigation, a lot more information came out, and it became abundantly clear that, in fact, MI5 had followed 2 of the alleged bombers a year or more than a year before 7/7. They followed them for 200 miles, they'd got their home address, they'd had records of phone calls between them and other suspected extremists. They had a lot of information. So then we got the second ISC report in May 2009, and they arranged a detailed timeline of what MI5 knew, when they knew it, and what they did about it. The problem is, at the inquests, an awful lot of these documents and an awful lot of the testimony that we heard completely contradicts this timeline. It says that fundamentally MI5 did not know these things when they told the ISC they knew them. They actually knew them well in advance. So the ISC once again issued an annual report, 2010-2011 annual report, looking at these discrepancies in the timeline, and they just accepted MI5's excuse that this was just, poor record keeping, and that they hadn't, been able to find the paperwork when they were asked for it, and there was no intent by MI5 to deceive the ISC. So what has emerged from the official investigations is that the security services had a lot of information on the alleged bombers, and in particular Mohammed Sidique Khan, the man who is supposed to be the ringleader, the mastermind of these attacks. In fact, they'd come across him at least a dozen times in the years before 7/7. Almost every single time, leads weren't followed up, or information wasn't shared, or searches on databases didn't turn up information that it should have done. So I'm going to take a look at one particular strand of this, and then have a quick look at what I think it all means. One of the major parts of this story of intelligence failures focuses on the Iqra bookshop and learning centre up in Beeston, which is a suburb of Leeds. And this bookshop has been portrayed as a sort of hotbed of Islamic radicalism that may have played a role in turning these men into suicide bombers. Among their various activities at the bookshop were trips to the countryside. They would take young lads off to the Lake District and things like that. One of the central figures there was a man called Martin McDaid. He was a white British convert to Islam. According to witnesses from the bookshop, McDaid was the one who was doing all the ranting and raving. He was the one who was, if you like, preaching extremism. He is basically the only evidence that there was any kind of radicalism going on at that place. Now, in January 2001, so even before 9/11, a joint MI5 West Yorkshire Police operation followed McDaid and several other people to the Lake District. They were filmed, they were photographed, probably even more surveillance. It may have been even that their conversations were bugged. We don't know. But among those who were filmed, who were caught on camera, were Mohammed Sidique Khan. Now, they had a picture of him in January 2001. The exact story of who they showed it to and when is a bit muddled, and I won't get into all of that, but fundamentally what they're saying is no one identified Khan from this picture until after 7/7. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. But moving on a little further, in April 2003, a couple of years later, there was another joint MI5 West Yorkshire Police surveillance operation. They followed McDaid around, Martin McDaid, they followed him around Leeds for a couple of days. They noted, who he met with, where he went, what he was up to. Again, they came across Mohammed Sidique Khan, or at least they came across his car. They saw McDaid get a lift in this car, and they did an immediate check on the registration plate and traced it back to Mohammed Sidique Khan. So they had his name. But apparently, they never passed this information on to MI5. It was West Yorkshire Police actually on the ground with the cameras and the cars following these people, and they supposedly never told MI5 about this. Well, why not? If they considered the information important enough to do a check on the car straight away to find out who owned it, well, surely the information was important enough to pass on to the security service. At the inquests, two different excuses were given for why they didn't pass on the information. The first is that the lift in the car was only a few minutes, and therefore it wasn't considered significant enough. But as I just said, it was significant enough to check up on it, but apparently wasn't significant enough to tell anyone. The other excuse they gave was that the information wasn't relevant to the purpose of the operation, of the surveillance operation. But the thing is, neither West Yorkshire Police nor MI5 have told us what the purpose of the operation was. So they are hiding behind, operational reasons without making it at all clear what these operational reasons are. So where is the accountability? Where is the, Yeah?
Just a question to clarify. West Yorkshire Police, were they instructed by MI5 to follow
Martin McDaid?
Yeah, and then report back all this time?
Well, we don't know exactly what MI5 asked them to do.
But they were working on MI5's behalf?
Yeah. MI5 requested that they do the operation. Yeah. So later in the year, in December 2003, West Yorkshire Police carried out further investigations into McDaid, and in particular into the Iqra bookshop where he was hanging out, apparently preaching his extremism. They found out that the bookshop was run by McDaid and another man called Mohammed, and that it was a registered charity. Now, logically, the place for them to have got this information is paperwork that was filed with the Charities Commission by the people at the Iqra bookshop. The problem is that on this paperwork there is a list of names of trustees of the charity, and that list includes Mohammed Sidique Khan and Shehzad Tanweer, two of the alleged 7/7 bombers. They're pretending that they never actually looked at this paperwork, and MI5 came up with this novel and entirely ridiculous excuse, saying that by December 2003, Khan and Tanweer were no longer involved at this bookshop, so therefore it wouldn't have mattered whether or not they were looking into it at that time, because they couldn't have found any information. But this is fundamentally untrue. This is a lie, because it makes no difference whether or not they were still involved there. Their name was on the paperwork for another year. If they looked at that paperwork, they would have found their names. And I'm pretty sure they did actually look at that paperwork, because I can't think of anywhere else they could have got this information. So, into 2004. In February and March 2004, both Khan and Tanweer, both Sidique Khan and Shehzad Tanweer, were seen during Operation Crevice, which you will probably have heard of. This was a Metropolitan Police and MI5 investigation into what has been called the fertiliser bomb plot. It wasn't much of a bomb plot in as much as they never built a bomb, they never selected a target, they never established a means of delivery. It was basically a bunch of guys sitting around idly chatting about possible terrorist attacks. attacks. They didn't really do very much at all. Anyway, they linked Mohammed Sidique Khan to various people that they saw during Operation Crevice. They traced 2 different cars to him on the paperwork, so they had his name, they had information on him, they had his home address even. And after the fertiliser bomb plot had been broken up, they arrested everyone at the end of March 2004. They then launched an additional operation codenamed Scraw, which was an attempt to find out more about these people that they'd seen during the surveillance, to try and establish who they were and whether they posed any kind of threat. So in June 2004, they sent an email, MI5 sent an email to West Yorkshire Police and the Special Branch North East Regional Intelligence Cell asking for more information about Sidique Khan. A reply comes back, identifying Khan, giving his date of birth, previously known addresses, and a caution he'd received from the police for assault back in 1992. But the reply said nothing about the 2003 surveillance on Martin McDaid, when they established that McDaid had been in this car that belonged to Sidique Khan. So why did the search not turn up Sidique Khan's name? That information would have been put onto the database when they had it back in 2003, so when they searched in 2004, they should have found it. So why didn't they? And this is one of the things that was actually asked at the inquests. They avoided lots of important questions, but they did ask this one. The excuse that was given is possibly the most ridiculous excuse I've ever heard, and it was basically, we couldn't find any technical reason why the database search didn't turn up the information, but it's all right, because the database is working again now. So ask yourselves this. If you had a problem with your central heating system, and you called in some plumbers, and they spent months rigorously checking your whole plumbing system, costing a fortune, and then they come to you at the end and they say, well, we couldn't actually find anything wrong with your central heating system, but it's okay because it's working again now, and here's your bill. Would you pay them? Would you put up with this from your plumber? And I put it to you, if you wouldn't put up with it from your plumber, you shouldn't put up with it from the security services. So what's going on here? One possibility, even a probability I think at this stage, is that this fellow Martin McDaid at the Iqra bookshop was a spy, working for the British security services. He may have been a double agent. Consider this. Back in 2002, his name was leaked by the security services to the Times newspaper as a possible extremist up in Leeds. McDaid was never arrested, either as part of the 7/7 investigation or part of any other investigation. He was subject to long-term but relatively sporadic surveillance. All of this surveillance uncovered a lot about McDaid, but strangely never uncovered his relationship to Mohammed Sidique Khan. He was also reported to have been ex-SBS, Special Boat Service, which means, if that's true, he was part of a elite British Special Forces unit that comprises, I think, about 250 people, so a very small unit. What are the chances? What are the chances of someone that served in the British Special Forces turning up and playing a vital role in the 7/7 investigation? His connection to Mohammed Sidique Khan was never mentioned in the first ISC report. They apparently didn't know about it. His connection was mentioned in the second ISC report, but he was never mentioned by name. He was simply called a possible extremist. McDaid himself has now disappeared, and no one seems to know where he is. So, was he a spy? Putting all this in context, the same story that's seen with McDaid is seen with several other men who also appear in the background of the 7/7 investigation. A guy called Mohammed Babar, who I'm sure most of you have heard of. He was reported in The Guardian in one of the rare articles that's actually covered a controversial aspect of this case. There's also another man called Mohammed Koyun Khan, known as Q, like in James Bond films, who was the supposed ringleader of the Operation Crevice fertiliser bomb plot. Now, Q, like McDaid, was never arrested. Mohammed Babar was arrested, but got away with admitting to the most horrendous terrorist crimes and served about 4 years in prison for it. So there's a pattern here, and I think it's highly likely that all three of these men, Martin McDaid, Mohammed Khan, Mohammed Junaid Babar, were all working for the security services, either British or American. Now, in each case, there were significant intelligence failures, or at least alleged intelligence failures, that strangely failed to uncover the relationship between the alleged 7/7 bombers and these apparent double agents or spies. So the result of this is that each time the security services had information before 7/7 that these alleged bombers were doing something suspicious, they failed to exploit the information. They didn't follow it up. This means that every single time they did something that could later be used to make them look like suicide bombers, MI5 did nothing. So the picture that's now emerging is that the intelligence failures didn't just have the effect of preventing the security services from stopping the bombings or preventing them from arresting these alleged bombers ahead of time, but also of protecting these people who are likely spies, and as I say, protecting the relationship between these people who are spies, probably, and the alleged bombers. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions. Were these intelligence failures actually intelligence successes? And was the point of all this to help create legends, backstories for these four alleged bombers, that after the attacks could be made to make them look guilty? Thank you.
Take a couple of questions.
Any questions?
Sometime before the attacks, there was an exercise done by the police in which a simulation was done of something similar happening in London. I'm not talking about the thing that allegedly was happening on the day. I'm talking about something that happened about a year before. And this was reported by local news, by London television. And in my cynical way, as soon as I saw that report, I thought something like this is going to happen soon. Just like your comments on your feelings about that.
What we do know is that, in fact, there were a number of exercises, possibly half a dozen, possibly even more than that, in the 2-3 years before 7/7, that in some way predicted the attacks. But the thing is, you do have an annual exercise on the London Underground that is an annual emergency service exercise. So the fact that they were running one perhaps isn't so suspicious. It's a relatively logical thing to do, because emergency service on the Underground is quite a tricky thing. It's something that needs to be trained for and exercised. But there are a lot of other exercises too that never exactly predicted 7/7, but predicted elements and aspects of it. So one could kind of go down the route of maybe these exercises were being used as some kind of preparation or cover for the attacks. But I think what we can establish and what we can be certain of is that this scenario of a terrorist attack on the Underground was basically the scenario that they were thinking about. It was the scenario that they were predicting, and therefore it is rather strange and suspicious that that is the scenario that actually played out. Without more information, I wouldn't want to go further than that. But it's an avenue of investigation, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you. As a comment for what Ian was saying earlier on, while I have absolutely no difficulty in believing in security service conspiracies on either side of the Atlantic, I also think it's not. We shouldn't underestimate the sheer incompetence of these forces as well. And there were long running going back from their inception, jealousies and competitions between the CIA and the FBI, and I think it's quite possible that information wasn't passed from one to the other simply because they were jealously guarded in the interests of one agency over the other, rather than a more conspiratorial notion that they were hidden to protect the hijackers. Another minor example is after the planes hit the building, the New York police couldn't communicate with the New York Fire Brigade because they were quite deliberately on radio frequencies that wouldn't allow them to communicate with each other, again because of institutional jealousies and competitions that went back right into the 19th century when the two forces were originally formed. The other thing about McDaid being an SBS member, I think I read there's also an ex-SBS member who's been identified as working with Irish Republicans.
Yeah, John McGee.
Yeah, and it's on a slightly different tack. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, Socialist Worker has been investigating the links between News International, the Met, and there were people from the Force Research Unit, which was a secret security force, security services group in the north of Ireland, whose almost specific task was pointing out to loyalist paramilitaries Republicans for assassination.
Like Patrick Finnegan. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And they have also been, it's turned out that several members of the FRU have been involved with working with private investigators. I think one of them was involved in the murder of the guy in the Sydenham car park. And it's just... it's interesting that the way that these security people somehow find their way into...
they do turn up in other places. Yes, certainly.
We're supposed to be having lunch now. I think it's probably time to finish. I just say in response to that thing about the CIA and the FBI, it is a bit depressing that I can give you chapter and verse of a guy who's worked for years on this. I've worked for years on it, and just to hear the sort of trite story about how we go, it's probably because the FBI and the CIA didn't like each other. That doesn't go a quarter of the way to explain it. If you don't believe me, check it out for yourself. Please do not repeat these myths, which, I'm sure you're doing this in good faith, but Socialist Worker is part of the gatekeepers on this issue, I'm sorry to say. I wish they'd behave otherwise, but they're not the good guys when it comes to false flag terrorism. They're the gatekeepers, and effectively, I'm sure it's out of incompetence and denial and wanting to believe these myths that come out of the BBC that, I'm not saying they're consciously allies of the CIA, but in effect, a lot of the traditional left are effectively de facto allies of the CIA. I'm sorry, it was a big disappointment when I came to understand that.